right, thank you, everyone. If everyone could have a seat, that'd be appreciated. So good afternoon and welcome. My name's Cameron Puron. I'm president and co-founder of Sentinel Medical, which was sold to Hologic last year. I'd like to thank you for joining us here this afternoon for our oncology session. And I thanks to Bruce Prower for their generous contribution of this theater. We're honored today to have our panel, who've agreed to share their time and their experience with us. The oncology space is a fascinating convergence of pharma, medical devices, computer science, biology, chemistry, raw physics, and engineering. It's been leading to real breakthroughs on our understanding of cancer and accelerating improvements of our ability to manage the disease. For instance, our management of cervical cancer has evolved incredibly quickly. Beginning with the cancer at a terrible mortality rate and moved to a screening program, then automated testing technologies, and recently spread through wide use utilization of HPV vaccine. We're an example of here in Ontario. A bold initiative was established to screen women classified at high risk for breast cancer for using magnetic resonance imaging. This program is admired around the world and has led to saving a significant number of women's lives. This also marks one of the first utilization of true personalized application of medical care. So even with all this excitement in the field, there's some real challenges that were discussed actually at yesterday's session in the neuro session. Issues such as raising capital from scarce funding sources to enable companies to take a concept from idea to prototype to product to profit. It's in this area that I've recently been focusing my personal efforts as I left Hologic, and I focus now on facilitating getting funding to some of these small companies and start seeing some further development in the medical device space. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Peter Goodhand. He's president and CEO of the Canadian Cancer Society. Peter has more than 30 years of international experience in the healthcare industry. He is the president and CEO of MEDEC, the National Association of Canada's medical technology industry, and also chair of the board of directors for the Health Technology Exchange. He sits on a number of other boards, including Mars Excellence in Clinical Innovation and Technology Evaluation, Xcite, and the Canadian Cancer Research Alliance Steering Committee for the Program to Support Clinical Trials Network. So thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Cameron. We're obviously keeping one eye out for the missing panelist. The good news is he's a marathon runner, so if he has to run all the way from Cancer Care Ontario, he still should be here on time. We'll also go with him last. I'd just like to echo some of Cameron's points and take a few minutes to set context here. And in doing so, I'll wear both hats that bring me here, both the CEO of the Canadian Cancer Society and the chair of the board of the Health Technology Exchange, which I've done for quite a while now. So I'm going to say why oncology for this panel session. I've got three, perhaps four reasons for saying why we should focus on oncology in a session on advanced technology adoption. And the first one I'm going to switch, and I'm going to keep on my Cancer Society CEO hat, and I'll use the word not oncology, but cancer. And remind everybody, as if we have to be reminded, that this disease, amongst all diseases, is one that mobilizes people, but in many ways it terrifies people. There will be 175,000 or more Canadians diagnosed with it. There'll be over 75,000 will die of cancer, 300,000 people in active treatment, and over 1 million Canadians who will have heard the words that they never wanted to hear, which you have cancer. But increasingly, we see survival. We see more than 60% of people who've heard that diagnosis will go on to survive. And in many ways, they will survive because of better treatments, and those treatments will have come from better drugs and better technologies. And they will survive because of earlier diagnosis or screening, as Cameron referred to. So the changes, the way we can now offer something beyond hope, real promise to people with a cancer diagnosis, is because of the progress that we've made. But there are still real barriers to taking that extra step.
The oncology session, analysis of technology adoption, is commencing now in the Bruce Prower Theatre.
The other cancer perspective I'd share with you is that any of us involved in the field know, it is not cancer, it's cancers. It's not just 100 diseases, it's as many diseases as people's person, as their genetic profile brings to this disease. It's a combination of the cancer and the individual. And the more we dig deeper into this through research, the more we realize the specificity of this disease and how many different ways we have to treat it in how many different patients. So, real progress against some cancers, over 95% survival, and others, we're still where we were when we started the society. I didn't actually start it, but in 1938, when the society was started, in some cancers we've made almost no progress. In others, we're almost at the point of a cure. The second reason, though, and I think the reason that in this context, why oncology, is that there is a remarkable confluence in Ontario of not just the need, which we see across the world, but some real assets, some very significant assets that can be brought together in a way that we should be able to make more of a difference here, not just for Ontarians or Canadians, but for people around the world. And I'll focus on the research where we've got real depth at many different levels, but we have flagship research at OCI for many years, more recently at OICR, and it spreads. It's not just on University Avenue, it's their linkages across the province and beyond. We've got excellence in clinical trials. We've got the clinical trials group, the NCIC one, we've got OCOG, we've got the Princess Margaret Consortium, a real asset in clinical trials. We have a highly organized cancer system under Cancer Care Ontario that with a real focus on quality and patient and improved outcomes, and with an awareness and a receptivity to appropriate use of technology. We have in Ontario, the Ontario Health Technology Assessment Committee, and Les Levine's work on OTAC, which is trying to make sure that the right technology is in the right place and it's fully fundable at the point where it's delivered to patients. And I think that sense of a continuum from basic science that's well funded all the way through to adoption into an organized healthcare system, it's not unique in the world, but it's something that we have here. And if we can take it from different solitudes and people working in silos and make that system come together, then we should be able to accelerate change in Ontario. The other thing we've got is large multinationals with a commitment to investing in Ontario, in Canada, and doing that, furthering their global work here in this province. We've also got highly innovative and entrepreneurial, innovative companies coming out of our universities, coming out of our academic healthcare settings, and with a willingness to move forward. So it's a matter of creating the linkages, and it's a matter, as Cameron said, of finding the money, these missing pieces that will get things pulled together. But I think I'll focus on the topic here, which is this technology adoption. And I think everything I see across the country is that we're beginning to realize that the job is not done when the technology comes out of the university or the hospital. It's not even done when the product is launched. It's when it goes into clinical practice, when it changes clinical practice, well, it's fully funded. And I think perhaps the clearest example we've got of this today is in the program that we're involved with Mars Xcite, where we're actually using health technology assessment pre-market, not coming in a year or 2 years later and saying your product won't be funded, using the same methodologies upfront, assessing the technology, improving the product, improving the uptake of that, making it quicker, making it better. And I think it's a great example of all sectors, the teaching hospitals, industry under the banner of HTX, Mars Innovation, and others coming together to say, let's use this health system we've got, not to stop change or restrict change, but actually to encourage innovation. We're very fortunate today now to have a full panel. Welcome, Michael. Who will share with us their experience from 4 very different perspectives. We'll leave it to each panelist. They've got 2 slides each. The first slide will introduce themselves, and the second will be their guide to talk to you for 3 minutes. And then we'll open it up for questions from the podium and then questions from the floor. So thank you for your patience in that delayed start. The previous group was a little late clearing out. And I'd like to now get us going. Our first panelist is Luigi Gentile. Luigi is Executive Director, Pathology Innovation Center of Excellence at GE, Pico, a global R&D and commercialization center established in Toronto as a partnership between GE, HTX, and clinical collaborators. And welcome, Luigi.
Can you hear me all right?
No. in a moment, you'll hear from Luigi.
Hello? Great. So thank you, Peter, very much, and thank you for the invite to join this panel. Briefly about myself, I'm not a lifer in GE. I've just come to GE within the last 16 months to be the executive director of Pico. My career to this point actually started in neuroscience research out of the community of research hospitals that are associated with the University of Toronto, starting first at Sunnybrook, looking at psychopharmaceutical research, following that in the Department of Medical Biophysics at Princess Margaret Hospital, looking at the formation of amyloid plaques for Alzheimer's disease, and following that, spent quite a bit of time as an electrophysiologist and doing a lot of cellular and molecular imaging at Toronto Western Research Institute, after which I moved on to a Canadian life sciences company where I eventually led global sales and product development, focused again on fluorescence microscopy imaging, electrophysiology, and nanopositioning systems. Following that, I went to Olympus, Canada. After I was working with all the microscope companies, Olympus asked me to help run Central Canada for them, and I did that for a while, again looking at all the imaging systems around microscopy, digital pathology. And then this unique opportunity came about with GE to be the executive director of Pico, which was an interesting challenge because I had 15 different interviews and I had 15 different explanations of what Pico was. So what was unique was, and what was obvious was, this is a collaboration center. It was a center to drive innovation in pathology, and to execute on that innovation, what was necessary was to ensure that for it to be really successful, it needed to be a collaboration between industry, clinical leadership, and policy and government. Because those are the three kind of critical pillars that would essentially not just ensure that the invention is a good one, but to ensure that the invention can be used in a clinical way to affect patients, that effectively help drives policy and decision-making on how we treat cancer and diagnose cancer in Ontario, in Canada, and globally. So Pico, again, is a global center. It's headquartered in Toronto and Mars. Next slide, perhaps. And really our, what we're looking at doing is really understanding this new evolution of pathology that's happening. Pathology has a very important role in the patient journey, which is ensuring that the definitive diagnosis is made and then setting the appropriate treatment path for that patient. Pathology has been practiced in very much the same way for 125 years. It requires the pathologist getting a glass slide, doing the diagnosis under the microscope, and then saying what that diagnosis is and working with the oncology teams to determine the best treatment path. The idea of digitizing pathology is a challenge, and it's not just about basically just digitizing this process. It's actually about more than that. Once pathology is digitized, it has to integrate into the patient flow and the data flows upstream and downstream in that continuum of care. Otherwise, it won't have a real impact on care delivery. So really at Pico, what we're trying to do is work with our clinical collaborators, work with our policy collaborators to understand and do three things. One, develop the new tools and technologies that are necessary for this evolving field of pathology. Two, work with our clinical collaborators to understand what is the real impact of these technologies from a clinical point of view. And thirdly, once we understand how those first deployments need to work, is from a global perspective, make sure that we're working with clinical leadership and policy leadership to determine what the best practice guidelines need to be in this emerging field. So it is a pretty big comprehensive vision that we have, but it's based on pretty definitive modules, right? So first we have to digitize, then we have to integrate into the system, making sure that we're building these next generation tools like computer-assisted diagnostic algorithms, which we have some great partnerships we're developing to do this and developing in-house. And that will enable pathologists in the future to be able to digitally review, diagnose, consult, and collaborate. And once they're digital, essentially integrate into that continuum of care. So that's kind of Pico and me in a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Luigi. We'll have each presenter go through in a fairly short, succinct way their 2 slides, and then we'll get involved with the questions, and I think that's where the richness of the discussion will take place. So our next presenter is Frank Gleeson, who is Executive in Residence at OICR.
Thank you, Peter. Is that on now? Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. As Peter said, I'm Executive in Residence with the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. And in that role, it means probably that I'm getting older than most of the people I work with, so I get a title that, of that nature. And I provide commercialization advisory services to the OICR, and in particular spend much of my time acting as interim or pro tem management for new biomedical initiatives. So I have quite a number of business cards that I'm lucky enough to now be able to throw against the wall and see if I can get any to stand up on their edge. We have at the OICR an IPDC program called the Intellectual Property Development and Commercialization Program, which I'll talk about in a moment, and I sit on the executive committee of that investment program. And I also act as an advisor to 2 initiatives that the OICR has helped to create: the Center for Probe Development and Commercialization based at McMaster University, and the SimTech Imaging Initiative co-located at Sunnybrook and in London, Ontario. Prior to this role and prior to my current activities, I've had a number of different careers. I've highlighted a couple of significant ones. One as a venture capitalist with MDS Capital Corp. During much of the 90s, where I was a partner and senior vice president. And at the time, MDS Capital Corp. Managed over $1 billion in capital and was one of the largest life science investors in North America. I personally was involved in creating 12 newcos and syndicated over $250 million in financings for those companies during my tenure. And I just highlight one that you may have heard about, that was a drug development company based at McGill that turned into a big win recently called Geminex, which was acquired by Cephalon in Philadelphia for over $300 million with a phase 2 asset. Currently, when I'm not involved with the OICR, when my personal activities are focused on entrepreneurial events. Recently, I co-founded a stem cell therapeutics company called Vario Therapeutics. We were with Dr. Michael Rudnicki in Ottawa, who heads the Stem Cell Network of Canada. This was focused on novel biologics that activate endogenous stem cells. And we sold this company to Fate Therapeutics in San Diego about 2 years ago, and I remain involved with them in a variety of capacities. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in thinking about this issue related to the translation and the advancement and the adoption of technologies in oncology or elsewhere, I thought of a few things that might be useful to think about when you're starting or when you're involved in the process. One that I've seen over and over again, I've been victimized by it sometimes, and in other cases I've tried very hard to make sure that you're surrounded with excellence. And what I see in my role, quite repeatedly actually, and in fact I had a dinner meeting with some scientists last night, and this was one of the topics, is the great unevenness that I often see in new companies between the science and the types of people that scientists often surround themselves with. So a great mismatch in the level of excellence of the business people, the financial people, the legal advisory people that get brought in to help move a technology along. the tendency not to find the very best chief medical officer, but to find somebody that can fill the role and give you some sort of clinical advice. And this is often a fatal flaw that I have seen over and over. And sometimes it's hard to evaluate excellence in disciplines that aren't your own, but it's so critical. And then to benchmark objectively. Again, I've often seen so many PowerPoint presentations where you hear the fateful words, and this is a conservative scenario. And you know that people don't believe what they're saying, that it's not conservative, it's not objective. And to really understand in an insightful way what truly makes you different. And these are keys to actually being able to raise capital and move along a technology that often get glossed over sometimes until it's too late. And then the next piece in terms of strategies for emerging companies are related to implementing a financeable strategy. If you can't raise money, you can't move it forward. It's as simple as that. And yet, the financing strategy all too often is thought of something, it'll come later, or someone else will worry about that, or my idea is just so brilliant that as soon as somebody sees it, they're just going to throw money my way. How could it not be that? Sometimes that happens. It does happen once in a while, but it tends not to be the norm. And then to plan ahead and to anticipate and to focus on execution. And again, this is so very, very critical because the odds are whatever you've planned is going to take longer, and it's going to cost more, and it's going to run into problems you haven't thought about. So the more flexible you can be and the more you think ahead and plan for these things, the better. And in terms of the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research, through our investment program that we call the IPDC, just a couple of words on that. This is a program that's open to academics and companies alike. It is a very straightforward program. It is an investment program. It is a fund. We consider this a fund. The review process is extremely rigorous, but it's quite swift. So we don't take months and months and months. We do work very, very hard to bring in the absolute best in the world to look at opportunities and give us meaningful advice and then participate with us interactively in evaluating projects. And we provide feedback. The emphasis on the projects that we look for is related to proof of concept. This has been specifically designed for proof of concept work in novel, impactful technologies, whether they're drug or a medical device or software. We look at the full panoply of technologies, and we provide funding, which can range up to $1.5 million for successful projects over a period of 3 years. We are willing to provide management and translational support and expertise as part of the aligned investment, I guess you could say, with the money. So I would encourage you, if you have cancer-related technologies that you believe are impactful or potentially impactful in translation, to visit our website and take a look at this program. And I'll turn it over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. We just checked that since we were bumped by the people before us, I think we can run a few minutes later. So we should still get time for those questions. Our next speaker, our third speaker today, is Dr. Stephan Larson. Stefan is CEO of Tornado Medical Systems, and thank you for joining us, Stefan.
Thank you. As you'll see, my resume is considerably shorter than many of my fellow panelists. As Peter mentioned, I'm currently the CEO of Tornado Medical Systems, a company I helped found about 2.5 years ago. And our oncology-based product is focused on a very specific application, a very specific clinical application in breast cancer surgery. About 20 to 25% of women who undergo a lumpectomy procedure as opposed to a mastectomy need to go back for a second operation, what's called a re-excision operation, and that's because breast surgeons today don't really know whether they got it all, as they say, when they go in and remove the malignant tumor. There's no really good medical imaging technique for assessing the margins of an X-size lumpectomy specimen. So we're in the midst of developing a tool, a surgical tool, that uses optical coherence tomography as a medical imaging modality to solve this specific clinical unmet need in the world of oncology. A couple points about myself. Before I came to Tornado, I worked as a management consultant in the world of medical devices and pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. And my academic background is a little more in the side of basic biology. I did a PhD in biophysics, and before that I studied biology and medical genetics at McGill and the University of Toronto. Could I get the next slide? I wanted to bring to the panel, one particular perspective about technology adoption, certainly in the world of medical imaging and medical devices, and just to bring, sort of one or two facts to the table a little bit as we have our discussion here, to really bring home the point that even for a Canadian company, we're based here in Toronto. We have a facility in Thunder Bay. Most of our investors are Canadian. We receive plenty of generous funding from various Ontario and federal funding agencies. But nonetheless, our focus is quite squarely on the U.S. market. When we look to drive sales and drive adoption of our medical imaging technology and our medical imaging device, the U.S. market is calling to us for obvious reasons. Number one, it's right across the border. I can go to the U.S. and meet customers and partners and suppliers and contract manufacturers and regulatory agencies by hopping on a plane and flying for an hour or two. It's a very, very easy market for a Canadian company to get into. And of course, it's dramatically bigger. It's about 10 times the size of the Canadian medical market in virtually any subsegment of the market. Certainly for medical imaging equipment, I dug up some stats here. Those are in billions of dollars. I suspect that the U.S. market is probably underestimated there in terms of medical imaging equipment sales. So the point that I wanted to make here as part of the panel is that for a Canadian company, as we think about technology adoption, and what that means for us is selling products into the healthcare system. Our priority today is certainly on the U.S. market. But with that said, being a small company and with cash always being a constraint, if our home province of Ontario said, hey, we really want to use your technology and your product to solve this issue of lumpectomy margin assessments and reduce our re-excision rates, it wouldn't take a huge amount of dollars to flow our way to make us focus much more on the Canadian and the Ontario market. But absent that sort of market pull, that explicit market pull from Canada and from Ontario, our focus is always going to be on that big market, which takes just as much work to penetrate as this smaller market that we have here at home. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that perspective to the table.
Thanks, Stefan. It's interesting what people say and what other people hear. So Stefan said his resume was much shorter than his fellow panelists. I heard, I'm much younger than the old guys. Our fourth and final panelist is Dr. Michael Sherar, President and CEO of Cancer Care Ontario and a member of the Quality Council. And thank you very much, Michael, for making your way here and joining us.
First, my apologies for being late. Two issues. Tomorrow we have the launch of a major report on the quality of the cancer system in Ontario, public report, and it's one of the things that we do and we commit to through actually the Quality Council is a public report on the state of the system. So lots going on today, and then I had a little difficulty finding it, so sorry for that. I will be brief. I am a scientist by background, a medical physicist by training, and my areas of research are in minimally invasive therapies for cancer, but I've got a bit of an odd resume in that I've got into the management side of the cancer system, and President and CEO of Cancer Care Ontario, which is the agency, Crown agency that works on behalf of government and the Ministry of Health to drive improvements in the cancer system in Ontario. And actually more recently have been asked to take on a similar approach in the chronic kidney disease through the Ontario Renal Network, which we host, in driving improvements for that population. And I thought I'd give you a little perspective on how technologies are introduced into the healthcare system in Ontario, and then give a couple of thoughts about the future of that. And I've picked on a few areas because the way in which technology, certainly in Ontario, which is a single-payer system, how technologies get into the system actually varies wildly depending on the type of technology. So for example, drugs, cancer drugs specifically, we have a very rigorous process based on cost-benefit analysis and clinical effectiveness of those drugs. They're introduced provincially and they're reimbursed on a patient-by-patient basis, making sure that those patients have the qualifying indications for those drugs. And they're reimbursed through hospitals who provide those drug treatments for patients in Ontario. And so those drugs come through a central process for their provision in Ontario. And companies and disease site groups bring the evidence forward of new drugs, new indications that we should fund in Ontario. And we administer a new drug funding program in Ontario, which is now to the tune of about $230 million a year that pays for those drugs in Ontario. Diagnostic tests is an emerging area where we don't have a rigorous process for their introduction in terms of access to those diagnostic tests in Ontario. And I'm thinking particularly here molecular and genetic tests now around where there's good evidence around the pairing of those tests, for example, with drugs in a personalized way. Herceptin's a very good example of that in terms of its use, and a genetic test to determine women's eligibility and benefit from that drug. I would say we're in a process of developing that in Ontario, of a rigorous way to provide access to those tests in a high-quality way across the province. Medical devices are generally purchased directly by, if they're small dollar items, directly by hospitals who purchase those technologies to advance innovation in those areas. And we do have central programs in Ontario for evaluating those devices and providing guidance to hospitals in terms of the effectiveness and use of those devices and the cost effectiveness as well. But that's more guidance. There isn't a direct pipeline between that activity and the funding lever in Ontario, and hospitals will generally purchase that equipment themselves. In one area, which is a very high dollar value set of equipment, which is contributed by research in terms of the development of that technology, we do have a very central process for purchasing that technology, including innovations and research-led improvements in that technology, and that's radiation therapy technology. Cancer Care Ontario and Princess Margaret Hospital are the single owners of radiation therapy equipment in Ontario. We purchase on behalf of the entire province, and so we're a single buyer across all of the vendors for radiation therapy technology, and introduce innovations in the system in a kind of a planned way, whether that's CyberKnife or stereotactic innovations in technology. We will introduce those in a planned way in Ontario, sometimes in one or two sites where they can be evaluated, or where there's good evidence but a small number of indications and we want to evaluate them for other indications. So that's introduced in a provincial way and has a direct line to funding through Cancer Care Ontario for the introduction of that technology. The only other thing I would say is that in terms of the future of the introduction of technologies into the health system, medicine is going to become more and more standardized. And that presents both, I think, an opportunity and a challenge for innovation in research. I think both in the US and in Canada, probably maybe faster in Canada because we're a single payer system, but it's going to happen in the US as well, that the fiscal sustainability of the healthcare system is going to drive much more standardization. That presents a challenge of introducing innovation because we have a standardized approach to medicine. But what the opportunity is, I think, in terms of within that standardized approach, what are the innovations that drive increased value? And that value is going to be judged on the cost benefit of introducing that technology to solve any particular problem, in value for patients and value for the taxpayers, or for the purchaser of those services if it's in the US. And I think that change is going to have an effect in terms of how technology is introduced into health systems, both in the US and Canada in the future, and will have a big impact on the roots for that technology and how they're introduced.
So I'd like to thank all our panelists. I have about half a dozen questions here, which I'll ask them in order to get some of the cross-cutting stuff going, I hope. But I would encourage you, we should have time for questions from the audience. So I'll try and keep these questions moving fairly quickly, ask the panelists to give the fairly succinct answers so we can get to some questions from the audience. I would encourage you to think of them now so that we don't have that delay at the end. First question for you, Luigi. GE is clearly a global leader. Why is it selected Ontario to establish PICO or anchor PICO? And in addition to the talent pool, what other advantages does Ontario offer in the area of digital pathology or as a base for GE?
It's a great question, and part of I guess PICO's inception comes from GE's Healthy Imagination Initiative, which is a $6 billion corporate initiative focused on research and development, improving cost, quality, and access of all the systems that we develop. Part of that $6 billion, $1 billion of that has been focused towards cancer. So really doing R&D in cancer care. So again, GE takes a very global perspective on how we do this. It's GE. We could have put Pico on the moon if we really tried. The idea, though, is in Ontario, there were lots of great synergies to what we really wanted to do. In particular, one of the critical elements was we developed a system with the global perspective. Over 30 different pathologists globally and lab leaders contributed to the development of a system. But when we asked that group who would be the first to really try this in a clinical setting and demonstrate its validity, UHN put their hand up and said, we want to be the first in the world to demonstrate this is a real, this is the future of pathology. So having that level of partnership and engagement for us with the clinical partner is absolutely important. From a systems perspective, Ontario gives us a lot of advantages. The healthcare system in Ontario, again, it's a single-payer system. As Michael was saying, that gives a lot of analogies to several other global systems, internationally, and how healthcare is deployed there. The quality of pathology in Canada and in Ontario is first-rate. Again, with a great deal of expertise in digital pathology, we've always been early adopters in it. Again, UHN very much leading that from a global perspective. But again, across Canada, it's been our challenge to deliver pathology services in an equitable way, because 80% of our population lives within 80 miles of the U.S. border. That means 20% lives absolutely everywhere else. How do you ensure people in Moosonee, Ontario, or in Northern Health in British Columbia still get the equitable care that they get in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver? So from a systems perspective, Ontario and Canada have been very much have that global perspective on how can we develop technologies and demonstrate their impact from a clinical perspective and how they can actually, from a policy perspective, improve the outcomes of patient care, really.
Thank you. Stefan, you talked about the access, the proximity to the US market, and you also hinted a little bit about perhaps you could get something more from Ontario, maybe that greenhouse, that incubator, But I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on what more could you need from, or what more would you like from your home province, your home country, but really focus on that, because hopping on the plane's the easy part. What we hear time and time again is people can't really dig in and get access in the US in the way they hope. So can you just share with us a little bit more of how you see it, how you approach it?
Certainly. So in terms of, is the mic on? Yeah, you guys can hear me? Okay. In terms of getting access to the US, for us, certainly, we really looked at it in terms of the three dimensions, so to speak, of adoption of a medical device. And we can use the US as an example. You need regulatory adoption, clinical adoption, and commercial adoption. So in terms of regulatory adoption, it's straightforward to say, but it's hard to do. You have to get to know the FDA, get to know the people who are going to be reviewing your device at the FDA, and begin to understand exactly how can you craft your product and design your product in such a way that it'll go through the easiest regulatory pathway possible for your device. So we spent a lot of time ensuring that we could go through a 510K pathway. We were very clear on what the precedent device was, or the predicate device, excuse me, was going to be for our product. We left out some features. We redesigned our device as recently as a few months ago to ensure that this regulatory pathway was free and clear for us. In terms of clinical adoption, it's a matter of going and talking to the users of your eventual product, in our case, a device. So we've talked to dozens and dozens of breast surgeons, both in the US and in Canada. We focus a lot on US breast surgeons because there are some differences in the way that they practice breast surgery and lumpectomies and do their margin assessment specifically. Then in terms of commercial adoption, that's where it gets very, very interesting when you contrast the US experience versus here in Ontario. Knowing that we wanted to attack the US market first, we spent a lot of time ensuring that all of the stakeholders in that complex US healthcare system would want to adopt our device. We wanted to make sure that it improved patient outcomes to a population of patients that would care. We worked to make sure that the clinicians would actually want to use this thing and pressure their hospital administration to buy one. Wanted to make sure that there was a clear story for the hospital administration stakeholders. You know, why are they going to pay $100,000 for our device? How are they going to make their money back? How is that going to be a useful investment for them? And then obviously to the payers, both the public sector and the private sector payers in the US. What is it that our device would provide them that would make them say, yes, we're going to help and make sure that there's a reimbursement pathway here for you, et cetera. So I guess the long and short of it is, for us, it was a very broad and strategic approach to making sure that all of the stakeholders involved in actually buying this product eventually down in the US, in the market that we were targeting, would feel like it was a win and a useful product. And that whole process, I think, is something that we could quite easily, I won't even say transplant, that we could just apply here in Ontario as well when the time comes. Obviously, the exact set of stakeholders will be different. They have different names on them and different agencies, et cetera, but I think the overall approach of really understanding your stakeholders is this exact same approach that we would want to take here in Ontario.
Okay, thank you. Frank, you talked about the specific program, the IPCD at OICR. I wonder if you could perhaps either with that as a base, or just more generally talk about the unique opportunity or potential that we've got with something like OICR and a CCO as a highly organized, quality-driven system manager, and the other players in the game. So perhaps, and Michael, I'll come to you with the other half of that question. So our government making a huge investment in both highly regarded organizations. Tell us a little bit about the collaboration between OICR out and CCO in.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So the IPDC program, the Intellectual Property Development and Commercialization Program, over the last 4 years since its inception, has made 16 investments. So we have, on average, done one investment per quarter. Over that time frame, the program has evolved to really become more of a fund-oriented program. And also during that time frame, we've seen a difference in the type of investments and the type of applicants that are coming forward. We've seen an increase in the quality, the number of applicants, and also our approach to them has changed quite a bit. The most noticeable change we've made is that we've increased the scale of the investment opportunity initially from $500,000 over a 2-year period to $1.5 million over a 3-year period. And we did that because, quite frankly, of the quality of the opportunities we were seeing. And we also wanted to be able to attract more companies forward. Initially, this program was focused on academic intellectual property only, and we expanded the hunting ground, so to speak, to include companies resident in Ontario. Now, our focus is on cancer, obviously, and on translation in cancer. So the real purpose of this program is to recognize that early stage technology in this field, and it's true in other fields, needs a helping hand. We're not the full solution to take something to the finish line, obviously. Many more aspects are required and much more money is usually required. But what we're aiming to do is provide pivotal money at a juncture when a technology is at that tender stage of not quite sure yet if it has the real potential to be successful or a knockout, but far enough along that the signals are all positive. And then the second thing is to try to bring the additional skills to the table that are so important in moving a technology forward. And as Stefan has just discussed, and Luigi earlier, there are a multiplicity of things that need to be addressed in moving a technology to a point of adoption. And often because of resource constraints or sometimes a lack of awareness, many important aspects are not considered or not evaluated or not brought forward until it's too late, or until you've made a commitment to a certain design, to a certain clinical trial, to a certain understanding of what the clinical utility of the technology might be, and you're trapped. And you find out that that really isn't the route that's going to lead to a regulatory approval, or it isn't the route that's going to lead to a large enough number of clinicians taking this on board, and you can't recycle. You can't get back the time and the money and the resources. So we try to bring some of the skills to the table. We try to meet with the successful applicants on a regular basis in a formal, structured manner, not to be judgmental, but to be helpful. We'll bring board members to the table if that would be useful, if it's a company situation. We'll bring advisors in, we'll bring regulatory people in. We've brought FDA people in to look at technology specifically with very, very pointed questions that we wanted to get answers to, where the company or the academic in question simply couldn't write the check to bring that kind of skill in for a couple of days. So we try to be situational, and the focus is always on moving the technology to adoption. That's our focus.
Michael, I wonder if you could give us the other lens on that, and perhaps, I think there's a very, very, very small thing called a 1 millimeter challenge that you perhaps share with a perspective with OICR on. I wonder if you could talk about that as a specific.
Well, I think we are fortunate in Ontario that we have a cancer research, provincial cancer research effort, and actually a huge amount of cancer research going on across our institutions in Ontario, as well as the work of the OICR. And as you say, we've got a cancer agency that's charged with developing improved systems for care across the province, and that presents a huge opportunity for innovation and research. We already have several programs that we work jointly with the OICR in terms of the research that's being done, how it can influence our agenda in terms of system improvement in Ontario. I think we've got a ways to go to make sure that we do have a system that's not only standardized, providing best care, but is a very good receptor for new innovation and technology. with the lens of how it's going to improve healthcare and reduce the burden of cancer in Ontario. And the OICR has the related, of course, mandate to develop economic activity in Ontario associated with that. And I think the relationship with CCO can facilitate that too, with examples like the GE innovation in pathology, that we have a provincial approach to pathology in Ontario that can be a testbed for new approaches in innovation that are going to lead to better quality, better standardization, lower cost, better outcomes. And so I think that's our opportunity, but challenge and obligation as two agencies in Ontario to make sure that we can work towards being an attractor for innovation and research activity in Ontario, based on the fact that we have a single system that can provide a testbed for that.
Okay.
Imaging is one example of that. Imaging is hugely strong in Ontario in terms of research and innovation. And again, there's the opportunity to demonstrate and evaluate those innovations and the research developments on a population. If we can develop programmatic provincial ways of doing that, and so that it's not at the individual program or hospital level, but that we might be able to evaluate these on a population level.
Okay. Thank you. I have a couple more questions I could ask, but I think I'm going to pause at this point and ask if we've got any questions from the audience. If you have got one, please come to a microphone, give us your name, and fire away.
Is it on? Hello, my name is Andrew Yoshioka. I had a question generally for the panel as to what the opportunity would be to publish any standards towards value improvement or healthcare improvement that would be attractive to Cancer Care Ontario to distribute the limited amount of funds available to deliver cancer care, such that the innovation side could then aim their actual development processes towards meeting those value targets.
Take it away.
So that's a very good question. I mean, we have in the past, and you see this in the US, but it's a changing environment in that we are charged more and more to demonstrate where the value is in the system, what the opportunities for improvement in a very quantitative, measured way, and what resources we're spending on breast cancer patients, for example, in different phases of the journey. What are the opportunities for improvement? And we're working as an agency to develop that capacity to have a very good financial picture of where resources are spent and how they're leading to improvements for example, breast cancer patients. And then I think there is the opportunity on the same kind of model of how new research and innovation can improve that. I think health systems across the world are struggling with increases in costs that are way above GDP increases. And it is going to come down. That rate of growth is going to come down in healthcare. So the challenge will be how innovation and research can drive cost savings in the health system.
Any other panelists with a private, perhaps more of a private sector perspective on that question?
Well, I think, well,
Go ahead.
From GE's perspective, what I think is, and part of what we're doing at Pico is, to Michael's point, is really trying to understand what are those critical barriers from a cost, quality, and access perspective that we need to understand around pathology, and how are we collaborating from a clinical perspective to make sure we are answering those questions that are important for the clinicians, making sure that they can deliver the highest quality of care, but in particular for the regional health authorities and health leaders, and that are responsible for those communities, right? And so I think a lot of our focus is really about really understanding and collaborating and spending time with the clinical leadership, the medical and policy leadership, to make sure that there is a lot of synergy there, right? And I think that needs to be an open dialogue. I think my advice is not to wait for, here's the holy grail of exactly what you have to be targeting, invention at. Innovation is is taking that idea, right, taking that invention and collaborating in a way to make sure it's executable, to make sure you're using it in a way to make something better. And what you have to make better is really the dialogue that you have to engage with, you know, in terms of clinical leadership and policy leadership. Otherwise, otherwise you risk just, inventing for invention's sake, which is often very important, but not focused at improving patient care and outcomes, right? So that's kind of PICO's perspective around it.
Okay, Frank or Stefan?
I certainly think the question is very much along the right lines. One of the things that we did early on in the product development cycle for this imaging product I mentioned was to actually put together, with the help of some expert assistance, was to put together an economic model of a breast cancer lumpectomy. Who gets paid what, when, who gets reimbursed, what happens if the rate of re-excision is reduced, et cetera, et cetera. And for us, understanding what that model looked like obviously helped us with things like the eventual price of the device that we could demand, the overall model, the commercial model that we could pursue, and also obviously the value proposition. Just to talk about value, the value proposition that we needed to be able to present to the various decision makers. I'm a pretty simple guy. I like to boil it all down to dollars. So, let's build a model that says exactly how many dollars am I going to save everyone in this chain of care that we call breast cancer surgery.
Yeah. And in the case of the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research, there are some theme areas that we're focused on globally. For instance, although, as Peter pointed out at the beginning, cancer is a dreaded disease and one in which people are often quite terrified at diagnosis. It's also an overtreated disease. In some disease areas, it's radically overtreated. In some areas, it's grossly overdiagnosed. And so these are all huge costs to the healthcare system if people are overdiagnosed and overtreated for a disease that could be dealt with in a more friendly manner, let's say. The problem is that cancer, or one problem of many, is that cancer is a very personal disease. And so the emphasis is on understanding the personal genetics of cancer with a view to being able to diagnose earlier, diagnose response rates earlier, diagnose response to treatment earlier. So some treatments, for example, in today's environment, some antibody therapeutics might cost $100,000 per treatment, and you might need 2 or 3 cycles of treatment. And yet the benefit is to less than 20% of the population that are diagnosed. So you're giving 80% of the people a $100,000 treatment for which there's no chance there will be a benefit simply because you can't screen them out or screen in the people that will benefit. So it leads payers to say, we won't cover the cost for anybody because we can't identify those who will benefit. So these are the types of challenges at a macro level that we're trying to address.
Okay, thank you. And I will add one, I'll cross hats here from the cancer world, which is the symposium. But if we put it from a medical device, a medical technology piece, there is the initiative I mentioned up front, and it includes MARS, it includes Ministry of Economic Development, Ministry of Health, academic teaching hospitals, and then HTX and MEDEC representing the industry. And we're using, in this project called Xcite, this initiative called Xcite, to actually use health technology assessment pre-market and actually answer some of those questions using the very same system that would normally assess it post-market. And it's not specific to cancer, it is specific to devices. Perhaps we have time for one more question. Do we have another question from the floor? All right, then I'm going to ask each panelist just very, very, very quickly, say if there's one thing you could do to make things better, wave your magic wand from an Ontario base, whether you're aiming globally or you're aiming it. One thing to do, what would it be? Michael.
Gosh. one of the things that I think we're putting a lot of effort into is around technology and supports for patients rather than providers. So there's a lot of effort going into information technology that's going to support patients during their healthcare journey and their cancer care journey, and technology aimed at patients directly as consumers rather than providers.
You know, I think I would be remiss to sit on a panel like this and not mention the dearth of venture capital funding in the life sciences and medical device and therapeutics area. I think a lot of the fantastic innovation that occurs, especially in Ontario with its tremendously strong biomedical research community, I think a lot of that innovation just doesn't make it to the market because there's not enough money out there. We're not, as a province, as a community, as an industry, we're not attracting enough venture capital money in the scale that's required to really allow all of these innovations to blossom into fantastic products. And frankly, for a lot of them to fail. We have to give them a chance to fail. And that's what venture capital is all about. And the more we can start attracting it to Ontario, the better.
So Stefan has taken my, as a business guy, this was the one I was hoping I could refer to. I think that's very important, and I think we're building a community of individuals in Ontario now that have succeeded in new company formation, have succeeded in technology formation. And so the one thing that I think would be the most helpful is for these people to become more and more involved in helping the next generation to move ahead and be successful.
Okay, Luigi.
Well, I think I think I'm going to go back to this original theme of people, process, and product. And, this is, those are the three elements that you really need to drive innovation, right? It's not just about invention, it's about execution. And you need to make sure it's done in a way that is improving and empowering healthcare providers to improve patient care and outcomes. And I think, again, we've been very lucky and very successful in the year and a half that we've been actually driving innovation and proving that technology can work and working with our great collaborators. And I think what can improve is continuing this theme, right? And definitely showing that with this kind of perspective, industry, government, and clinical leadership can work together to actually lead the world in new cancer strategies, the development of technologies, and how they can actually improve the healthcare strategies for Canadians. Like this is a wonderful thing that we're doing. We have to be proud of it, and continue to invest in this philosophy because it can work, right? And not all innovation, as Stefan said, works, right? It's part of the model, right? You have to. Some of it needs to fail, and that's okay, right? That way we can get on with those ideas that can win, and make sure that we, as a community, are investing and finding those right ideas, and making sure we have great investment in this pipeline of invention and execution, and empowering our inventors and supporting them along this path. I think that's a great perspective to have.
Okay, so it's fairly simple. More of a focus on patients, more money, a community of serial entrepreneurs who are going to come back and coach and guide and mentor other people, willingness to fail and take chances, and a spirit of collaboration amongst all parts of this sector. And if we do that, I'm guessing we should have healthier people and a healthier economy. So I'd like to thank the panel and invite Cameron to come back up.
So I'd like to thank the panel, Dr. Sherar, Dr. Larson, Frank Gleeson, Luigi Gentile, and of course our moderator, Peter Goodhand. Looks like we solved a lot of problems today, so you should congratulate yourselves. I'd also like to thank Bruce Power for the generous contribution of this presentation theater. And with that, we have some tokens of appreciation here.
can hand
Actually, I'm going to pass them down
Yeah.
here. Here we go. So with that, that concludes our discovery programming today. So please feel free to explore the show floor, and also I believe at this time is the Backbone competition finale, and that's at the Gowlings Theatre, so that's worth checking out. So thank you very much.